Hello, and welcome to our conversation about cancel culture hosted by Independent Women's Forum. I'm Hadley Heath Manning, Director of Policy at IWF, and I'm joined by two very special guests today. We have Sophia Nelson, who is Scholar in Residence at Christopher Newport University. Hi, Sophia. Thanks for joining us. We also have Christina Crenshaw, who's an Associate Researcher at the Dallas Theological Seminary and a visiting fellow at Independent Women's Forum. So welcome to you both. I will say you ladies probably have a lot in common, but one thing you have in common is you've both been canceled. So we're happy to give you this platform here to talk about that experience and tell us a little bit about what happened to you, what it means to be canceled, and what it meant for you personally. So let's start there. Maybe Christina, you want to go first and tell us about your experience and what does it mean to be canceled?
Sure. Yeah. Coincidentally, Hadley, today is the 1-year anniversary since I spoke up on Twitter against the Title IX mandate. And essentially, it was one tweet responding to a like-minded colleague where I just said, hey, this is unfair. This is unsafe for women. And those of us without gender dysphoria should have a voice at the table on this. And that one tweet, one retweet went viral. My husband and I joked that it was the tweet heard around the evangelical world. I am at a Baptist university, or was at a Baptist university. And, the first week, not much happened. People responded the way Twitter works, rude comments, no big deal. But then the student newspaper wrote an article that went viral as well. And the title of it was "Dr. Crenshaw is transphobic and needs to be fired." So it proceeded to call me unsafe. The School of Social Work at Baylor University started a petition to get me fired. Thankfully, and Sophia and I can talk about our contrast, our similarities and differences, but thankfully in my case, I had a lot of people rally around and support. So I would say there was a small group of really progressive, loud, kind of angsty students who wanted to see my career ruined over my stance on keeping males out of female spaces, but that the vast majority of people within my sphere of influence really did rush to my support. And eventually, it took a solid week, maybe even 2 weeks, but the university did respond with a free speech civil discourse statement. Not much about their Christian mission, which was, a different issue, but at least I did receive that support from the university. So yeah, that was my first foray, hopefully my last foray into having a perfectly reasonable stance that most Americans hold, but realizing that that might not be where Gen Z is. And if Gen Z disagrees with you, then they'll go to extreme means to make sure that you pay for that. So similarly, Sophia, I know you had quite the experience as well on your campus.
Yeah, Sophia, tell us about what happened to you.
Well, like Christine said, it's kind of the tweet that was heard around the world. In my case, I have a big platform. I'm in the media, and it took about 3 or 4 days before it ratcheted up. And I got a text from my dean. God bless her. She had just gotten back from Scotland. She's the most wonderful person in the world. And she said, "What happened on Twitter?" And I'm like, "What do you mean what happened on Twitter?" Because like you, Christine, you get a lot of comments back and forth, but it was commentary. So I was good with that. I didn't see anything that alarmed me. And she said, "Well, the campus is in an uproar that you're against gay people, that you're anti-LGBTQ." And I'm like, "Excuse me, huh?" And it took me a minute to realize that in my case, I had asked a question about a tweet that I saw from DC Comic Books about their new bisexual character that was Superman and Lois Lane's son. And the picture that they tweeted was of one young boy grabbing another and kissing him. And I saw that as millions did and commented as millions did. Only I asked the question, and my question was, how do Christian parents talk to their kids about this? Because many won't be able to do so. And you would have thought I did something horrible, because within a week, it went from being a Twitter discussion that had nothing to do with my campus, my new position as the first Black female scholar in residence in the history of the school, by the way. And the mob that came after me, starting with faculty and students, was horrific. I don't think I've been through anything so awful in my entire life. It was at first shocking, and then it became very ugly. Like Christine, you make us unsafe. You've triggered us. You've caused us trauma. You're not trusted. You're a purveyor of hate. I'm a bigot, I'm a racist. Yes, Black woman racist here. And, you know, I am all these ugly things. And once it starts, you can't stop it. I was
Yeah.
silenced. I wasn't allowed to speak for weeks until I demanded that you either let me run this letter to the entire campus or I'll do it in the Washington Post. And that's what it had to come to.
Wow. Thank you guys for sharing about those experiences. I'm sorry to hear about these things that happen, but I'm also glad that both of you are interested now in fostering solutions to this. You wrote an article I want to mention in Real Clear Politics recently about your experiences facing what you call campus groupthink and, you know, suggesting some ideas to combat cancel culture. So first I want to ask, what do you think is at the root of cancel culture, or what are the forces behind this trend of silencing people, as you mentioned, Sophia? Sophia, you want to take a first crack at this question?
First and foremost, whenever we cancel another human being's thoughts, free speech, whatever, there's fear. There's fear of something I don't understand or I don't know or I don't like. The second thing is it's being driven by these diversity, equity, and inclusion statements, positions, indoctrination, if you will, that's taking place everywhere, not just on college campuses and corporations. It's happening everywhere. And like Christina, I'm a proponent, obviously, of diversity, inclusion, opportunity, all of that. I've benefited from it. So have both of you. So I don't think anybody here is against that. The problem is that we are coming up with this one thought that you have to follow these mandates and these guidelines. And if you diverge from them or have a different viewpoint, you're the enemy. You must be destroyed. You must be removed. You must be replaced. That's authoritarianism. That's fascism. That's not America. And that's definitely not free speech.
Christina, what do you think is at the root of cancel culture?
Yeah, you know, no book was recommended to me more after what happened than The Coddling of the American Mind. And I stayed up and read it in 3 days because it resonated so deeply with what I had experienced. I think I had read the Atlantic Monthly article that the authors of Coddling the American Mind wrote, but I had not read the text in full. And so I think what I gleaned from both my experience and the data that they provide is that sociologically what we have is a generation, younger millennials, Gen Z, who live in a silo, and we don't ask them to actually civilly engage each other in person. So what happens is we have these hot takes, minor thoughts, quick tweets, and that becomes the way that they communicate. And so instead of actually parsing out the conversations that they would be, you know, historically we've been forced to do, you know, I have said to people, the idea of canceling, the idea of shutting people down, that's not necessarily new. Human nature has been the same since the beginning of time. But what is new is this social experiment with social media where the loudest voice gets to win instead of the best ideas, which again is classical liberalism. Let's bring the best ideas to the table, and may the best ideas for the common good be the ones that rise to a place of influence in the public square. But now what we have is the loudest media voices, we have the loudest hot takes. And so students have been, as Sophia said, indoctrinated into this sort of engagement. And so it's really difficult for them to encounter anything that seems to go against whatever narrative they're following, that they're not able to have nuance.
Christina,
sure, go ahead.
On that, I just saw at one of the colleges where a group of students of one group, I think they were African-American students of color, and they have this space in the library that they call a safe space for the Black people or the Hispanic people. I can't remember which group. And some white male students came in and sat down within that space, not of course knowing it was the safe space. And there were actions taken. There were problems. And to me, my God, if that's what we're teaching our young people, and I've said this time and time again, we're teaching them to fail because life is hard. Life throws stuff at you. You're going to take stuff at work, in your marriage, with your friends, with your family that you don't like, and you're going to have to discuss it. And none of us has a safe space that we can hide from other human beings other than maybe in the basement of our house, right? And that's if you don't have children. And at the end of the day, you are dealing with the coddling of the American mind, like Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt said, is amazing because we're raising them to be afraid and fearful. And they're very clear. If they don't like what you say or what you think, they're going to take you out. There's not going to be a dialogue. It's a protest. It's a petition. We're going to destroy your career. We're going to follow where you speak and tell them if they let you speak there, we're going to protest them. And so it becomes this much bigger thing of not just what's going to happen to me immediately when they don't like what I think or say, but what's going to happen to me long term is significant, and corporations are afraid of these communities. They're afraid to violate these statements and these indoctrinations. So even if they don't think you've done anything wrong, I've had plenty tell me, ladies, we can't have you speak, Sophia. We love you. We love your works, but we're going to get protested if we do. They'll come after us if we do, because now on the internet, it says you're a homophobe or transphobe or racist, whatever. We don't think that's true, but we can't rock the boat. What the hell kind of world is that we're operating in?
Okay, I want to push back and challenge you guys a little bit, because while I love everything you're saying, and I've read The Coddling of the American Mind, and he talks about training kids, teaching kids early to be anti-fragile instead of creating these fragile young kids who are maybe part of the college demographic today. I think there is a different mindset about cancel culture that says this is a tool. This is an important tool that people, particularly maybe people who are marginalized or who don't live in the power structures of our society, it's a tool to take away the microphone from people who have maybe unacceptable viewpoints. It's a tool to shame those viewpoints out of the public discourse. What would you say? How would you respond to that and make the counter argument that cancel culture's not a good tool to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say just like any tool, it's become an abused tool. If a tool is not used appropriately, then it becomes a weapon. So I would say it's no longer a tool, that it's actually become a weapon. And I, again, kind of coming back to what we had discussed a little bit earlier, asking the question, is this for the common good? I can think of times where I would say we shouldn't necessarily call it cancel culture, but actually pushing back on a proposed idea. And one that is of relevance that comes to mind was it Drexel University that had the professor who was advocating on behalf of MAP, people who are attracted to minor attraction person, and Drexel University, I believe is Drexel,
it's ODU actually here in Virginia. It was Old Dominion University.
Old Dominion. I thought it had a faith-based Catholicism tied to it, but they said, hey, you're going on administrative leave, and I thought that was interesting because they didn't fire him right away, so I would say that wasn't a cancellation. And I would also argue that his proposal for changing sort of pedophiler behavior to softening the language around minor attraction person is not best for the common good, that does not benefit our children. But when, Sophia is asking, hey, is this really a good idea to put such a salacious image on the internet, to make Superman son bisexual just for the sake of making him bisexual, to appease LGBTQ narratives. When I was asking, is it really safe for biological males to have access to biological female spaces? These are questions, again, that we are asking for the safety and common good of us all. And so I would say that that's a good litmus. If somebody is bringing forth an idea and you're like, this really actually is not going to further human flourishing, that this is really not productive for the public square, then right away, that should be a red flag for us, red flag, as the kids say these days. But then I would also say that, it also is the repercussions that come after it. Are we looking to ruin someone's livelihood? Then that's not an effective tool, that's a weapon. And that is essentially what Sophia and I experienced. I had to call my kids' school too and put my children on alert because they were threatening to confine them at their schools. Again, that's no longer a tool, that's a weapon. So
I want to just add to that, Christina, and it's a great question because, as I said at the outset, and I want to be unequivocal, if you followed my Twitter thread that day on National Coming Out Day, which I had no clue it was that, so that really made them mad, is that I'm absolutely against homophobia and any of those things, as I think all of us are. We don't agree with that. What I don't agree with, however, is something you asked in your question, which is, who determines what's unacceptable viewpoints, thoughts, or speech in the United States of America? That is the bedrock. In this case, for both of us, it was really a religious freedom issue, a religious expression issue. For me as a Christian, as an aunt of now grown daughters, I don't have the blessing of children, but my nieces are like my children. When they were little, if I had seen something like that, I would have taken it away. And then I would have talked to their parents about it and been like, we probably have to talk to them because I don't know what they may think about this or not. Anytime something is different or new, we need to have dialogue about it. And if we're going to introduce an LGBTQ plus figure, flip it this way, ladies. What if there had been an LGBTQ plus professor at my school and DC Comic Books put out a tweet that they were going to have a Christian character flying through the air with a cross around their neck, And that LGBTQ professor said, I don't think that's right. I don't think there ought to be a Christian superhero. That I find that objectionable, because knowing they won't agree with certain lifestyle things, whatever, I promise you that professor would not have been protested, disciplined, or anything, because it doesn't work in the reverse. That it just doesn't happen. Take any instance of cancel culture that you've seen in academia, except for the one we just brought up at ODU, where what he was advocating is paramount to a crime. You understand that, right? You cannot take children because you're attracted to them, and you can't help who you're attracted to and take people's children and be with them. That doesn't work. That doesn't fly. So that was really over the line. And I think even members of the LGBTQ plus community agree with that. My point is, we don't see this in the reverse. So it only happens to Christian conservatives or people who are not operating, again, within the structures that have been defined for us by these free speech, academic freedom, conduct on campus policies. I mean, people have no idea. It's really bad. They're limiting what you can say, do, and think more and more every day.
Right. I think the conversation about cancel culture raises some important questions about who really does hold the power over our public discourse, because it seems to me that in some cases it's the mob. It's the mob who holds the power, and not the people who are in effect the victims of cancel culture. But I want to move to a question that we are actually getting online through the Facebook Live. We have a viewer, Carrie S., who's asking a question for you, Sophia. She says, you grew up in Germany. No doubt you learned about life in a communist regime in the former Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had severe mind control and surveillance. Do you see parallels growing with America today?
So I didn't grow up in Germany. I was born there. I was 1 year old when we left and came back to the United States. So I did not grow up there. But it's a good question. And I said it. You guys know my background. I'm a political analyst, thought leader, columnist. So I got these dual hats that I wear as an academic, but also as someone that involved heavily in politics and political discourse. And we see it playing out every day. It's not just on college campuses. It's on our politics. It's in our corporate boards, like I said. And there's no more dangerous place, in my opinion, for anyone than Twitter. Twitter's dangerous because you can get in a lot of trouble on Twitter by asking a question, by saying what Christina did and saying, I don't agree with that policy. And then it takes on a life of its own. So I think we're already in the throes of what we would call classic authoritarianism, because the state, as it were, and in this case for me, you were at a private school, Chris. I am at a public university. They have very different functions. That public university acts as a government actor. So they've got to be very careful what they limit and what they do. But what's happening, to the lady's question, is not so much that we can't say stuff. We can say whatever we want. The problem becomes consequence culture, which is something that this generation embraces fully. They embrace it not just in the discourse on social media, they embrace it in families. We have family members in my new book that we'll talk about another time. I talk about how families are literally being ripped apart by generational differences in how we deal with conflict. Your parent disciplined you, or they didn't come to enough of your games. You think you've been abused. You think you've been neglected. And then you cut them off. You don't want to talk to me anymore because they're toxic. So this is actually serious. I don't want to trivialize what we're doing here today, because it's not just about Christina and I getting in trouble for something we thought or said. It really is about the consequence culture that takes on a life of destroying you, threatening her children, threatening me. Some of the things I got on email and inboxes were, I don't have words for how bad.
I bet horrific. Yeah,
horrific.
I think in addition to this consequence culture that you're talking about, we're also seeing a lot of censorship. And if it's not blatant censorship, it's a lot of self-censorship. You know, you talk about going on Twitter. How many times have I used the backspace button thinking, you know, I'm having an insightful thought, but I'm fearful about sharing it because people might misinterpret or take out of context or make it look like I've got a bias that I don't have. And so I think there's a lot of self-censorship or chilling of free speech as a result of this terrible climate around cancel culture. And so I want to pivot to what some of the solutions might be. And you guys discuss in your article, Christina, I'd love to hear some of the solutions or suggestions that you guys put forward in terms of how do we right this ship? How do we turn this thing around?
Yeah, one of the things that I really was thankful that Sophia was willing to lend her voice to, because it was something that I'd long wanted to talk about, but didn't feel that I could as a white woman. I didn't feel I had enough intersectionality to speak to more progressive ideologies. And Sophia and I joined voices to say, hey, we need to stop conflating race and gender, that there is a difference between biology and the difference between how you're treated based on the color of your skin, that essentially one is sinister and it's evil and one is meant for safety, that we can't conflate. And that's an argument that I have heard, that we want to make sure that we're not violating anybody's civil rights. I think to that, Sophia and I would say, yes and amen. But there's a difference between civil rights and civil preferences. And particularly, I would say in the case of, me speaking up against Title IX, just because your preferences are not being granted, you're a biological male who identifies as a female and you want access to female spaces, that is not the same argument as, when we historically, prior to the civil rights movements, tried to segregate people based on the color of their skin. So I think that, sort of this argument that we parsed out here is we can't conflate arguments. So there is a difference between, when we're having a conversation around something like biological sex versus how you identify with your gender versus your ethnicity, that these are different conversations and they need to not be conflated. Right. So that was one of our solutions, that we need to have conversations that are, again, not integrated unfairly, unjustly. And that was one of the ones that we brought to the table.
I think one of the ones that's most important to me gets back to this, who has the authority to say what I can think, speak, tweet, etc., and what is the consequence of that? And you see that happening here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We have a new governor who in his first week really has gotten himself a lot of attention because he is really cracking down on exactly this. The new diversity, equity, and inclusion officer is a good friend, Angela Saylor, who comes from Heritage, a conservative think tank. That didn't go over well. And Angela is the new diversity, opportunity, and inclusion officer. So in Virginia, they're swapping out the word equity for opportunity. And the reason that is, and one of the things that the governor said in his executive order, which is something we talk about in our piece, is that you have got to create a space, particularly on college campuses, where there are viewpoints that vary and where there's basic civility. So one of the things that I would like to see in free speech statements with universities and all these different statements is, yes, of course, we respect and we want to protect the rights of marginalized groups, people of color, LGBTQ plus women, etc., all the classic groups that fit into Title VII and Title IX, right? But then you have to go beyond that, and you have to look at, there's religious freedom in this country. So a Christian, a Jewish person, a Hindu, a Muslim, an atheist, if that's their non-religion religion, all of us have to be free. For me, that comic book character was indeed offensive to me as a Christian person looking at, is this something that I can get behind? Is this something that I would want my nieces to have seen when they were young, or one of my godsons do? Is that, and no, I wouldn't be comfortable with that if I can't fully explain to them how I take them to church on Sunday and they're getting taught one set of values, and then they're seeing something in their comic book and they're, Mom, Dad, well, what does this mean? Because at church, we're saying that marriage is between a man and a woman, for example, right? And then I'm seeing this in my comic book. What does that mean? Well, you better be equipped with an answer when your kid approaches you, and you better be able to square those two things. And I think that by silencing Christians or other people of faith with 2,000 years plus, Christine, as you like to say, years of biblical thought and doctrine on sex and sexuality, it really is there. I think it's problematic to shut us down and say that we're bigots and we're haters and we're evil, and you label us with all these names, and we back up because what else can we do? Because now I'm bad. I'm a bad person. I'm evil. I'm a hater, and nobody likes me. Nobody wants me to teach in their seminar. Nobody wants me to speak. Nobody wants me around. That's a problem. So we've got to start expanding these definitions of who is protected in these diversity, equity, and inclusion statements, because it must include people of faith. Absolutely must, because there has to be a right to have a faith. that you may not agree with, that's mine, as long as I'm not running around calling people vile names and doing things that are an affront to basic manners and decency and civility, why would I need to be fired and protested and harassed like that because I asked a question? That's not okay.
Yeah, I think there's a tipping point where even if there's no explicit ban on a particular faith or worldview or political perspective, if a particular institution becomes so overwhelmingly dominated by one view, then people with a minority perspective aren't going to speak up, not because there are rules against it, but because of the social consequences, because of cancel culture and so forth. So one interesting nugget that I found as I was researching cancel culture and looking into some of the survey data on this is that there's actually a pretty significant gender gap here. And this is something I want to just talk to both of you about. We're Independent Women's Forum. You're both women. And it turns out that women are more likely than men to say that they favor a, quote, inclusive society over free speech. And they're more likely to say that speech is a form of violence, which is something that you discuss in your article. So I'd love to get your thoughts on this. First of all, is an inclusive society, or inclusive societies and free speech, are those two things mutually exclusive? Do we have to choose between those two things? And also, if we're forced to choose, why do you think it is that women are more prone to say, I value inclusivity over free speech, or I'm okay with canceling speech that I find offensive to the point of thinking that it's tantamount to violence?
Right. I think if possible, Hadley, when you send out the live stream afterwards, like include a link to the New York Times article that you're referencing.
I will do.
Read it, and it was interesting. It was fascinating. It sort of skims the surface of these sort of biological differences between the way that women act in the public square or in leadership positions and the way that men tend to act. And it really, I think, validates and highlights a lot of the research that I have read that essentially says, and I hope I'm not being too reductionistic or overgeneralizing, but essentially that women tend to lead more from a compassion heart perspective, and men tend to engage more from pragmatism, what's more pragmatic. And of course, I mean, the beauty of it is that we need both. That one is not of greater value than the other, but when it becomes imbalanced, we lose our humanity and civility if we're just being pragmatic, and we also lose basic, like biological facts if we're just leading with compassion. But I would say that, Hadley, your question is exactly what I experienced. I received more support from males, whether that was male, undergrad students, or if it was male faculty who were tenured, or male alumni. Now, part of that, I think it's worth kind of giving this disclaimer. Perhaps there are more males in leadership positions who could lend their voice to helping me. That's a fair argument and rebuttal that I have heard, kind of a fair retort there. But I would say, again, generally speaking, the women were afraid that by siding with me, it would be negating the feelings of the LGBTQ community. And I found myself in this turmoil of really trying to reconcile that you can do both, that I can love my neighbor well while still wanting to protect my other neighbors, my female neighbors, who have, arguably more to lose by this new Title IX mandate. And so I think, Hadley, again, it's that parsing out and that nuanced conversation of, okay, compassion is good and it is necessary, but misplaced compassion is not justice. That's an injustice. And so I think that that's where particularly younger millennials and Gen Z are not maybe rightly seeing that if your compassion is actually harmful to the majority, then that's not a version of justice. That is.
Yeah, and I think to piggyback on what she said, because I actually experienced both things that you said. First, I was hurt deeply that the women who came after, it was women who came after me. It was not men. It was white LGBTQ plus women who were, I'm going to use a strong word, but I've used it publicly before in articles. I was being publicly lynched as a Black woman in a very white space. Christopher Newport University it has had problems. It has not attracted the kind of faculty of color and things that I know it strives to do. And hear me when I say, I'm not saying that the university did that. What I'm saying is that there were faculty members who didn't stop to see that I was different, that I was of color, that I fit into a marginalized group. And that because I had a different point of view and asked the question, the way they came after me and with the viciousness, and as you said, Christina, it was nothing about me mattered other than removing me and getting me out because they didn't like how I think and how I asked my question. It didn't matter that I tried to apologize sincerely as a Christian. If I offend someone, we've talked about this, I want to be clear that I am taking stock of that. I want to know what's going on and I want to talk about it. And I wasn't afforded that opportunity. The school will say, well, yeah, we set up a forum, but yeah, that was after you let me get destroyed for a month and have petitions, protests, the media on campus, terrible articles all over the internet. You think I'm going to sit down at the table with you then? Come on, that's not what we agreed to. So I think that we are in this space where women and women contacted me on Sidebar, faculty members who signed on petitions and said, after they heard my public statement and read my letter when I finally get to Senate, they called me and apologized and said, I didn't even know what was going on, but a peer said to me, sign this petition because we need to get her out of here. And they did it. They didn't even bother to check. They didn't learn. But because of groupthink, what we're talking about, and women supporting the women who were coming after me, they signed on to that kind of foolishness. And so it was white men, ironically, Christina, for me, probably for you, who came to any defense I had or any support was coming from them saying, this is disgusting. This is not okay. Yeah, there were professors that wrote letters to the president, but the kind of the end with this, and I don't know if you have another question, but to wrap this, I think if we're talking about whether it's men or women that participate in cancel culture, I want everybody in the audience to understand this is not just some phrase, cancel culture. It's not just some conservative thing or liberal thing. It is a real thing that if you go on your computer and look at college campuses, go to FIRE, they deal with all of these issues on college campuses. This is happening a lot, and people are losing careers behind this. Good people who support the LGBTQ plus community, support African Americans or other groups, people who have done good things, but they make a misstatement in some people's opinion, or they have the wrong viewpoint in some people's point of view. Would any of you out there like to not be able to pay your mortgage or feed your family or never be able to teach again because you made a mistake or you said something that didn't line up with what somebody else thought you should say? I mean, just ask yourself that question. And there's your answer. None of us would like that. None of us. And I think one of the most hurtful things for me, Hadley, was people getting on telling me I deserved it. I should lose everything, that I was disgusting. And I'm like, wow, we're asking a question. Yeah. Imagine if I'd have said I don't like LGBTQ plus people, something really bad. I don't know what would have happened.
Yeah.
Christina?
The real irony here to me is that, like, this is our job as academics. Like, my job is predicated on asking the hard questions, digging into research, gathering around, this sort of idea of a Socratic method. Like, let's have a nuanced conversation about this. And the fact that academics can't do that anymore is concerning. It's really antithetical to the entire purpose of a university, which is to, classical liberalism. Let's have a discussion about this unto the common good and human flourishing. And we're not able to do this. But it also grieves me, and I think this is where people are waking up. I cannot remember the author of this, but it was published in the Atlantic a couple of years ago. But the title is something along the lines of "We all live on university campus now." And he goes on to open his op-ed with, "I'm liberal, I'm progressive, and I'm scared of my liberal progressive students."
It was the New Yorker. It was, what's his name? Sullivan, Andrew Sullivan.
Yes, you're right, Sophia. Thank you for that, Andrew Sullivan. And so he, goes on to say, like, we have created a monster. The machine is out of control. What were just once critical theories on campus have now become, steadfast truths in the public square. And that's a problem. I mean, they were called critical theories, back to Carrie's question earlier about kind of like the German roots of Marxism here. And we go back to the Frankfurt School of Thought. These were all theories. They were lenses to look through life. And now they've become public policy. And I think most of us who have studied this are raising our hands to say, we're concerned, thus the coddling of the American mind.
Yeah. Well, I've loved this discussion, to go back to this question about an inclusive society versus free speech. Not only do I think that those things are not mutually exclusive, I think they have to go together. I think in order for us to have a truly inclusive society, we have to live in a society where people are free to live think, speak in accordance with their true selves. And if we can't be our true selves, then we can't really have tolerance. We can't really have inclusivity. We can't really have diversity. So I so appreciate this conversation. I appreciate both of you coming on to join us. This has been a conversation about cancel culture hosted by Independent Women's Forum. I've learned a lot from our guests today, who have been Sophia Nelson, scholar in residence at Christopher Newport University, and Christina Crenshaw, associate researcher at Dallas Theological Seminary and a fellow at IWF. Thanks again to both of you, and thanks to everyone who tuned in for this discussion.
Thanks
Goodbye.
for having us.
Thanks.